we are now heading toward a situation where the mega banks, through the Federal Reserve, might end up owning everything. And, we got a sneak preview of this in the Great Depression, right? The question is, which way do we go? If we let the elites, the establishment, the people running the Federal Reserve, the people running the UN and the IMF get their way, they've already told us where this is going. Plain and simple, in plain English, in black and white. You can read their publications. They told us what they want. They want a one world currency controlled by the International Monetary Fund, of course, controlled by themselves.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest. Alex Newman is a journalist. He's an author and foreign correspondent for The New American. He's also founder of libertysentinel.org. He joins us again this Monday, May 11th, 2020. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's so great to be with you. And, it's funny, since the last time we spoke, now suddenly all the preppers look like geniuses and everybody else is scrambling for toilet paper. So it's great to be back with you. Thank you very much for having me.
It was nice to not be in the fray of the other, The Walking Dead, scrambling for toilet paper at Costco, yes. We met you in person at the Red Pill Expo in Hartford, Connecticut. Got to hear you speak there about the plight of American education and how it's nothing new. In fact, it was planned and by design. We're going to ask you a little bit more about that today, but we're also going to get into some very current topics on how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting, and the reaction to it, really. I guess that's more of it, is the policy response to it is affecting many aspects of our life, both economically and from a liberty standpoint. So 3 main questions we want to get on tonight with you. The first one is again, we'll start with the policy response to the coronavirus, talking about government overreach. Has the Constitution been set aside permanently, or can we still put government back in its place? After that, we'd like to then move on to how we were set up for this in a way, to be an obedient populace, to toe the line by the dumbing down of our schools and media, and has this been making us, quote-unquote, lockdown ready as a culture? And lastly, we'd like to circle back on what this has exposed about underlying huge distortions and vulnerabilities in our economic and financial edifice, including insolvent pension crisis that has been coming, but maybe now here and in our face. And will the banks bail out everything and everyone and own everyone? So can we start back at the beginning about government overreach and this response, the official response to the coronavirus pandemic, and with a focus on our liberties, and has the Constitution been set aside permanently, and can we put the government back in its place?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me on. And these are just such enormous and incredibly important topics. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you about them and to talk with your viewers and your listeners about it. It's just so important. And so on this coronavirus and the issue of the Constitution, we just produced a special report that just came out in the New American magazine. And I think this is the first time ever we're actually making it available 100% for free. Just go to thenewamerican.com, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see, coronavirus freedom is the cure. Click on that, and you can get a PDF version of this absolutely for free, and you'll get a much more comprehensive treatment than we'll have time to provide today. But what's happened is the Constitution has just been completely 100% thrown out the window on every single front, right? Historically in America, we've had quarantines. Quarantine is, it's been seen as constitutional, but what we had 100 years ago or even before as it relates to quarantines was very different than what we have today. And I think it's a really important distinction to make. Historically, quarantine meant quarantining sick people while they were sick. And after they were not sick anymore, they were free to go and they were, had all their freedom again. What's happening now is completely different. Now we're saying we're quarantining people who are well. That's not actually a quarantine. It doesn't even make the definition of it. Doesn't meet the definition of a quarantine. It's also incredibly dangerous. The precedent that's been established here, if this is not overturned, if we don't push back on this, it's going to be incredibly dangerous going forward. Anytime some authoritarian president comes along or some authoritarian governor comes along and says, I feel like locking everybody down. I feel like shutting down all the non-essential businesses, and I'll decide who's non-essential. And I don't think anybody should go to church. They'll just say, the flu is around again. Sorry, we're just going to have to keep you all at your homes. And hey, we did it before. What are you going to complain about now? So it's an incredibly dangerous situation. And it's affecting every single one of our rights, including the ones that are all enumerated in the Constitution's Bill of Rights. It's affecting our freedom to assemble and to protest. It's affecting our freedom to freedom of religion, right? They're telling our churches that they're non-essential and that they can't meet and that the pastors have to just obey the governor, and that's that. It's affecting our right to freedom of speech. It's affecting our right to freedom of the press. You see now the censorship on social media is just out of control. And of course, the government has been very supportive of these efforts. They've been planning this for a long time. And on down the list, right? In a lot of states, they said, "Oh, well, Second Amendment, that's not all that essential. Yeah, abortions, yeah, you guys can keep doing that. Oh, the pot shops and the liquor stores, go right ahead. That's essential. But no church, no gun stores, no nothing." And I mean, it is one of the most draconian restrictions on liberty you can imagine, imprisoning people in their own homes. Of course, there's no constitutional foundation for this, and if we're not careful, we're going to end up in some very, very serious long-term trouble, because it'll set a dangerous precedent that can and will be abused in the future. And, there is a caveat here, Dunnigan, and that is that the Constitution was already hanging by a thread before all this, right? I don't want to act like this just all happened overnight and suddenly, oh my goodness, now the Constitution's at risk. No, the Constitution has been at risk for a very long time. This is more a symptom of what has been a long-term problem, which is growing ignorance among the American people. The overwhelming majority of Americans don't even know what the Constitution says. They've done surveys. They've asked them, is from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Is that in the Constitution? And over half of Americans said yes. Right? I mean, that's straight out of the Communist Manifesto. Right. So unfortunately, we are in a constitutional crisis. Now we're starting to see the symptoms of that, right? Where the government can basically say or do anything, and we're just expected to mindlessly obey. It's very, very dangerous.
Well, on that point, could we zero in on that one point you just did about, you said a governor or an individual can declare, I'm going to declare a state of emergency, and therefore we take this rule book, we throw it to the side, now we got the rule book that is very different. And we've seen that in state after state, and sometimes on the local level as well, with certain mayors doing that as well, where they take over basically wartime powers. It's emergency powers, and it gives them sweeping control over all kinds of aspects of people's lives. And the strange thing about it is the lack of checks and balances. It's like in our constitutional republic, it was carefully crafted on this idea of checks and balances, balance of powers. But here it seems that there's an extreme concentration of power in one individual who can declare that a new set of rules applies, and then until I say so. It's like there's a bill underway right now it's been introduced in the Ohio legislature to put a 2-week time limit on that kind of sweeping measure. Before, there would need to be a bipartisan committee from the legislature that would need to validate the extension beyond 14 days, that sort of thing. So you start to broaden outside that single executive who can just take control like that. Can you talk to us about is this in fact constitutional, or is this something we've done to just shoot ourselves in the foot and basically abdicate our constitutional rights?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of pushback, and that's good. A lot of legislatures, you have seen some states now, the legislatures are suing the governor in the state's court system. And I've been very pleased to see that at least some of the judges in some of the states have been very responsive to this. So you had one of the Supreme Court justices in Wisconsin said, wait a minute, what is this? The governor could just, unilaterally make all these decrees, and we're expected to obey them. Where is that in our laws? Where is that in our Constitution? And that's good. That's really encouraging. As far as I know, there is no state where the laws of that state allow the governor to do anything at any time just by declaring an emergency. Now, it's true, most states have emergency statutes where the governor is allowed to declare an emergency and assume certain powers that are unusual, sometimes that are beyond the scope of what the Constitution would typically delegate to a governor. That's true. But these sweeping powers where the governor basically becomes a full-blown total dictator and decides, this business can open, that business can't open, the church is not essential, you must stay in your house, I'll tell you when you can come out of your house, you can go to the grocery store, but you can't buy that kind of food and you can't buy that seed because that's not essential. I mean, it is totally unprecedented. It's totally crazy. You can imagine stuff like that in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union or in communist China. But when you think about America, you think, no, we have the rule of law here, right? And the rule of law is supposed to define the powers of the governor and the powers of the legislature and the powers of the courts. Well, we're seeing that being completely trampled upon. It's so dangerous. So I've been thrilled to see the pushback. I hope it gets a lot more serious. We've seen now, in a lot of the conservative states, the sheriffs are saying we're not going to enforce this kind of stuff, even in some of the liberal states. So I think that's what we need. We need at every level, the citizens, the sheriffs, the county commissions, the mayors, all of them need to be pushing back on these usurpations of power, because frankly, this is not legal, it's not constitutional, and it's not sensible. It's very, very dangerous. And even if you trust your governor, okay, a lot of people live in states where, my governor's not that bad, he just wants what's best for me. Even if you trust your governor, what happens when the next one comes along? What happens, if you're a liberal, what happens when the next Donald Trump is your governor? Or if you're a conservative, what happens when Obama or Hillary is your governor? Do you trust them with that kind of life and death authority over every aspect of your life? And I think the obvious answer, no matter where on the political spectrum you are, should be no, of course we don't, right? That's crazy. And so we really need to, I think, react in a legal and responsible way to make sure this doesn't become established as what they're saying now, the new normal. We really need to push back on that.
Yeah, it made me think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where basically, foundationally we need security and nutrition and things like that, rest, and then finally it works up to higher level things that we desire. But the governor of Michigan declared that people could not buy garden seeds, and you mentioned gun shops being closed. So basically, be able to protect yourself, and being able to buy things so that you can plant your own. With the food supply in question, with the supply chains breaking down and meat processing plants all over the country and crops being plowed under and so on, people think, well, maybe I better put in a garden. Well, no, that's not essential. It's like, in what world, in what alternate universe, in what America? My parents had victory gardens that they grew, and they taught me how to garden. In what world would gardening not be potentially essential if you're going to see the risk of breakdown of the supply chain, unless you wanted it to be a world in which everyone became dependent on the central sources for their life, their stuff that they needed to live.
And I think that's part of the goal. I think they do want everybody dependent on the government. Look what they did here. They shut down our businesses. They shut down our jobs, right? It's something like 35% unemployment if you look past the government's fudge numbers and you look at the real ones. We've got like 30 million people have lost their jobs. Maybe 40 million people have lost their job just in the last few weeks. And then the government says, oh, don't worry. Yeah, we made you lose your job, but we're going to protect you. We're just going to print a bunch of money and hand it out to you. Excuse me, but that's not the American way. We are not helpless, dependent creatures of the state to be, manipulated and fed at the will of the state. This is such a dangerous precedent. It's so un-American, and it's so arbitrary too. If you look at the way these governors are reacting, not all of them. I got to give credit where credit is due. Governor of South Dakota, kudos, amazing response. Just use your common sense, right? Use your head. God gave you a brain for a reason. Don't be stupid. Don't go out and get infected if you're worried about it, and just use your brains. So some of the governors did a good job. But you look at Washington State now, right, where they're talking about deploying the National Guard and contact. We're going to come into your home and kidnap people out of there if we think they might be infected. We're going to quarantine. It's so arbitrary and capricious. And if you look at what happened in Michigan, it was just a great example of how absurd this is, that the governor is going to say that your seeds aren't essential, but, this is. And, who do they think they are? And frankly, who do they think they are to declare that we are non-essential? I would argue that the governor in many cases is not essential, right? So you stay home, and meanwhile, I will go back to my business, which in my opinion and in the opinion of my customers is essential. They wouldn't be shopping there if they didn't think it was important. So this idea that governments or governors get to decide who's essential and who's not, it's like out of a dystopian science fiction movie, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk to us now about how we've been prepared for that, because there's also a generational disconnect that's happening here. It's been evident for years, and I know you've been watching it, you've been talking about it, writing about it for some time, but you've got basically people who are like middle-aged and older who were brought up on the ideal of American individualism, about rugged self-reliance and that kind of thing, how we need the freedom to autonomy to make decisions at the lowest possible local level. So we have this feeling of I'm a effective director of my affairs, of my life, and that gives me motivation and everything else, versus the new generation that's been basically taught, no, they're welcoming, oh yeah, we should be following these things because it's for our own better good, and the experts are going to know, and we'll just follow the lead. And it's like, is this America? So talk to us a little bit about this, what I would call the dumbing down of our schools and our media that has been preparing us to be this lockdown-ready culture or lockdown-ready generation.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. This has kind of been my passion for some years now, ever since I wrote a book in 2014, Crimes of the Educators, and recognized that, whoa, it's way worse than I realized. So I think we're now several generations into this, and it keeps getting progressively worse. It used to be, to get progressively worse with each passing generation. Now it gets progressively worse with like every 5-minute
I'm
interval that
picking up on
passes,
that, progressively worse. I'm getting that. Okay.
Right. But I mean, it's gotten so extreme. You almost can't believe that this is reality. And so last year we put out this special report here, Rescuing Our Children. And one of the things we exposed was the dumbing down of the children. Now, we've got a whole article on that where American children, the smart American children of today, as measured on the academic scores and so on, are dumber than the dumb American children of the 1960s and 70s. That's how far we've fallen. And along with the dumbing down, I would argue that quite literally the government school system has now handicapped multiple generations of Americans. And by handicapped, I don't mean like, they can't walk anymore, but they can't think anymore. And that's almost worse than not being able to walk, because at least you can kind of, figure out how to get around that handicap. But when you're dealing with not being able to think, suddenly you become susceptible to manipulation, to tyranny, to idiotic ideas. And that's where we are today, right? The children in public school today, they don't learn logic anymore. They don't learn how to reason. They don't learn how to, sort truth from fiction. They don't understand how to pursue truth. Many of them, if not most of them, are reading disabled, and not all of them are officially categorized as reading disabled. Even the kids who, nominally do okay on the reading scores, they still struggle because they're being taught using quackery. And now we're starting to see, the effect of this, which is when you have a dumbed down population, it would have been inconceivable to impose tyranny on the founding generation in America. They were highly educated. They were all very familiar with their Bibles. They were very familiar with the Constitution. They were very familiar with the principles of self-government and so on. It would have been inconceivable to try to do some of these things that we see today in the generation of the founding fathers. They would have been inconceivable in the 1980s. But we keep getting dumber and dumber and dumber and more indoctrinated. So it's at the point now where they're teaching 5-year-old children things that are self-evidently absurd, right? They're teaching in kindergarten now across America. They're teaching children, as just one example out of many, that they might have been born in the wrong body, and that if they go, take some hormones and go to some gender treatment facility and, prepare themselves to be surgically mutilated by some lunatic posing as a doctor, that suddenly they can be a new gender and they can be their true self. Now, anybody with 2 brain cells on duty would look at that and say, wait a minute, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard of. You reject biology, you reject physiology, you reject DNA, you reject what the Bible says as truth, but you reject every possible source of evidence that we have to establish truth, and you believe something that is self-evidently ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's totally insane. And yet, we now see how effective this is, right? In California, 27% of the children are now identifying as gender nonconforming. So, boys who don't accept their boys or girls who don't accept that they're girls. We've got in Utah, 10,000% increase in the number of children undergoing what they call medical transition, right? Trying to transition from being a girl to a boy or vice versa. In Sweden, 1,500% increase in the number of children describing themselves as transgender. So that's how effective the brainwashing is. And of course, it's not just on the gender issues, right? It's when it comes to the role of government too. Previous generations of Americans understood what our founding fathers said. It's a self-evident truth that God created us, that God gave us rights, and that the purpose of government is to protect those rights. I mean, it's all spelled out right there in one paragraph in the Declaration of Independence for you. And this was so broadly accepted, it was described as a self-evident truth. We didn't have to have a debate about it. We didn't have to argue our case. It's just self-evident. Everybody knew it. Now today, you go talk to a kid in 4th grade or a kid in 8th grade or a kid who just came out of high school, probably can't even read his high school diploma. Hey, it's a self-evident truth that the government exists to protect our rights, and our rights include the rights of free speech and firearm ownership and all these things. They say, what do you mean God-given? There's no God. I learned that in school, right? We came from billions of years, slime. There is no God. And rights, what do you mean rights? Guns are bad and speech is bad. What about hate speech? Someone might be offended. And so we've gone through this incredible transformation. And what we're seeing today in terms of the government's response to coronavirus would have been inconceivable without this gradual dumbing down process that's been taking place now for, I would argue, over a century. And certainly it's been getting more and more extreme since the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And now we're seeing the end result. It's just, we're a nation of morons.
in the face of that, and the other thing you mentioned, the loss of the ability to reason and to communicate effectively and rationally, but you also talked briefly about people don't know their Constitution, they don't know their Scripture, that sort of thing. So there's this disconnect from the body of knowledge, from history itself. Can you talk to us briefly about that? And
yeah,
from the family,
I would argue
there's that's almost an intentional. I'll let you tell us. How do we know that that's an intentional goal of the educational system?
Yeah, well, one of the ways is just by reading the writings of the people who designed it, right? And John Dewey would probably be Exhibit A. And, he was a lunatic. He was a communist. He was a humanist. He rejected the existence of God. He rejected individual rights. He rejected self-government. But to his credit, I'll say all that, and then I'll say in his defense, at least he was honest, right? He wrote masses of papers and articles and journal entries and books and essays and all kinds of stuff outlining his views. And he told us what he was doing. For example, he was one of the drafters and signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. They just spelled it out right there. The very first plank is a rejection of the first words in the Bible. Right? The first words in the Bible being, in the beginning, God created. And so John Dewey opened up the first Humanist Manifesto with, we religious humanists, and to their credit, they admitted they were a religion, but we religious humanists believe the universe is self-existing and not created, right? So that was his plan all along. You keep moving down. He says, we got to get rid of the profit motive. We need a radical economic transformation. So we have equitable distribution of the means of life, or the means of production, as we would call it today. This guy went to the Soviet Union and wrote back all these crazy essays that were published in Mother Jones, the communist magazine, talking about how wonderful it was and how the education system was doing a great job instilling collectivist values in the children. This is crazy. But how do we know that this was the plan all along? Well, the guy who designed our public school system, and talk to anybody with an education degree from any college in America, let's say, oh yeah, John Dewey, he was the founding father of our progressive government school system. He told us what he wanted to do. He actually wrote an essay in 1898. We republished it in this book here because it's so important. It's called The Primary Education Fetish. We republished it as an appendix here. It's in the back, Appendix B. And, I encourage people to read this for yourself, this essay. You can find this book, by the way, in PDF for free online. And go read the appendix with John Dewey. He argues in plain English that, we spend all this time teaching little kids how to read and write and do math, but really that's not what they need. What they really need is to be properly socialized so they can understand, the greater good and all this. But this is the same rhetoric that Karl Marx used. It's the same rhetoric that Chairman Mao and Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin and Pol Pot and, Fidel Castro, Robert Mugabe, pick your mass murdering communist dictator. Same exact kind of language they use, right? We've got to use the schools to, shift away from traditional academic subjects and move toward this idea of collective, right? This idea that the group outweighs the individual and everything's got to be for the benefit of the greater good. And obviously our dear leader will decide for us what is the greater good, right? You don't really get any say in that. So they were very, very clear about their agenda. And after John Dewey, of course, his disciples were very clear too. And before John Dewey, you go back to Horace Mann, another guy. He rejected the Bible. He rejected, the traditional American view that government exists to protect the God-given rights of the American people. He rejected the phenomenal education system that we had in favor of a government-controlled model. And, their agenda and their writings speak for themselves. They wanted a dumbed-down population that would be more easily manipulated into giving up our constitutional republic and our individual rights and moving toward this totalitarian monstrosity that we're now seeing coming into view.
Before we move off this topic and onto the one of finances, I wanted to touch base with you on this. So, ironically, during this pandemic response, a lot of people the schools have been closed, all the way from, grade schools and daycares on up to all grades and colleges and so on. Students have been sent home. They're doing remote learning. So ironically, it's like almost every student in the United States now is suddenly a homeschooler, and every parent is suddenly thrown into the role of a homeschool parent. You homeschooled your children. We homeschooled our 5 children, and this isn't the same, though. This is different because a lot of those sources of information that are available to these students, ironically, are coming through these large social media giants and these online sources, which are even more heavily controlled and filtered than the textbooks were back when we did, Dick and Jane back in the 60s or so. But can you talk to us about what can people do now that their students are at home to try to restore some of the opportunity for their students to learn, to read, to reason, to logic, to know history, etc.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. And actually, I keep holding up these magazines because we keep writing about the subjects that we're talking about. But this one here we just came out with. It's a cover story that I wrote called "Coronavirus Opens Eyes to Homeschooling." And so you're right. We went suddenly from about 3 to 4% of the American population of children was being homeschooled to now almost 100%. But there's an important distinction between what's been happening amid the coronavirus and traditional homeschooling. Right? Traditional homeschooling is led and controlled by the parents, who choose what curriculum, when to teach, how to teach, and so on. What's happening, and this is happening in some areas, right? You had some school districts and even some states that said, oh, well, we can't have equitable government school at home, so you're just on your own, right? And that was a huge blessing in disguise. I think a lot of parents are like, wow, we can do this, and it's fun, and our kids are happy, and they're learning, and we're doing it in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost that the government indoctrination, public school was doing it for. Maybe we should keep going on this. So that's been phenomenal. But this kind of conscripting parents into serving as like agents of the government school system, I think it's very troubling. But there's also a silver lining on this too, and we talked about it here. Actually, I opened my story by interviewing a mother who actually went through this exact experience. So, the schools are pumping stuff into the home through the computers. They're sending kids home with laptops and iPads and different software they're supposed to do stuff on. And sometimes they're even doing like interactive, Zoom classes and things. And so what's happening is now the parents, many of whom are also home from work or, lost their job or whatever, they're seeing, often for the first time, the kind of filth and the kind of idiotic so-called education that their children are being exposed to. And they're appalled. I just wrote a story at Freedom Project Media last week, I think it was last week. A mother was monitoring the emails that were coming from the school to her middle school child, 13-year-old kid. And suddenly she sees one. It was an invitation to a private, invitation only, LGBTQ plus whatever, hangout for youth. And then you read a little further, and youth is defined as little kids all the way up to 25-year-old grown men, potential pedophiles looking for children to groom and exploit. And so this mom was absolutely horrified. I said, don't share this invitation with anybody. She said, my child is never going back to that school again. And I said, amen. That's brilliant. We need, and this is happening now all over the country. Parents are seeing the idiocy, the filth that's coming through, and they're saying, oh my goodness, that's what my kids are doing at school. I thought we were learning like math and history, not LGBT and gender ideology and climate change and, purple penguins and Heather has two mommies. So I think what's going to happen from this is we're going to have a giant exodus from the public school system, and it can't come soon enough. I hope if and when the public schools open, the elites are exploiting this. They're now trying to cut teachers out of the picture and move to like 100% AI, computer program learning, where you basically cut the teachers out because the teachers sometimes resist the indoctrination and the stuff that's coming through. So the elites will use this, but I think on the bright side, we're going to see a huge exodus from the public school system, and that may be the most significant silver lining of this whole fiasco called the government's coronavirus response.
One of the difficulties that families who do want to take a more active role in the upbringing of their children through homeschooling, for example, will face is the loss of income. Many upwards of 30 million or more Americans, actually it's a lot more than that because we're talking about perhaps 30% unemployment, have lost. As people were struggling through the last decade or two, the middle class was continuing to be pressured, and we were going from one income families to two income families plus side hustles on the side, and people were it was just getting more and more difficult. Now some of them, they don't have any income. So that's going to be really difficult for families who do want to do that. Can you shift gears to talk to us about the economic impacts of the response to the policy response to the coronavirus and how it has exposed some things that were already long time a brewing, like the insolvent pension crisis that we were already facing?
Yeah, and it actually goes right back to what we started talking about at the beginning, and that is the government's effort to make everybody dependent, right? If we had a legitimate free market economy, we would be wealthy and prosperous beyond anybody's imagination. We could in the 50s, a single, father could support his entire family with a normal job. Go to work and do your work, and you retire with a pension, and you have, good benefits, and everybody gets health care, and you have a car, and you have your house paid off. And that was in the 1950s and the 1960s. Since then, now we've had massive increases in technology and automation and productivity and agricultural yields. I mean, in every possible way, we should be just drowning in wealth. And instead, what we find is parents are under more and more pressure just to make ends meet. Why? Well, a big part of the problem is the governing class has been siphoning ever greater amounts of our wealth away into, in some cases, just wasting. And that would be the best possible thing. If they would just take all the money they're taking from us and put it in a big hole and set it on fire, that would be the best thing that could happen. Instead, they're taking it and they're making our lives even more difficult by hiring new bureaucrats to harass us and writing new regulation to suppress our business and to get involved in our affairs. So, the government has stolen, the average American now, something like 50% of what they produce is sucked up by federal, state, local, municipal, county, school district, water district, special taxing district taxes. And so, now you need two incomes to be able to pay all the taxes so you can support this enormous mushrooming group of government employees versus trying to support your own family. And that leads me to one of the things I know you wanted to talk about, which is the pension crisis. Now, this is the 8 billion pound screaming gorilla in the room that's just begging for us to pay attention to it, but that nobody wants to look at, right? And the government doesn't want you to look at. So we have a system now where government employees are like a separate caste of elites, right? Almost 20% of American workers are somehow employed in government. And what's happened is they have become this new category of elites, and they have a pension system. Just to throw some numbers out there, just the state and local pension plans of these government employees are running about a $5 trillion unfunded deficit. So they have obligations that they won't be able to pay. They're underfunded by $5 trillion. That is an unfathomable amount of money. I mean, we're talking almost $75,000 per American household. To put that number, and then they have another $5 trillion in these enormous, pension funds for the government employees, which they then use to buy stock in big corporations and then pressure them to, adopt their progressive politics and their social justice madness, and even the stuff that's, contrary to their own business interests. So, to put those numbers into perspective, because I know once you're talking about trillions, kind of people's eyes glaze over. What does that even mean? Well, to put that in perspective, just the $5 trillion that we have in unfunded liabilities for the state and local government pensions is more than all of the money that's supposedly in Social Security that's supposedly going to take care of the other, 80% of the American population. And that doesn't include the $5 trillion that they already have in their pension funds. And so now this coronavirus shutdown has started exposing the cracks in this. It's completely unsustainable. It's outrageous. It's ludicrous. And I don't mean any disrespect to government workers. I have tremendous respect for firefighters who put their lives on the line, get people out of burning buildings. I have tremendous respect for police officers who put their lives on the line to protect and serve their communities and protect the rights of the citizens. But this system is not sustainable. And keep in mind, the police and the firefighters are a tiny fraction of what we're dealing with. You have, and some of the ones I've looked at, you have, for example, in Coral Gables, it's a municipality in South Florida, you have a telephone operator that retired with a $68,000 per year pension that goes up by 3% every year. So now it's at about $90,000, $95,000 per year. After 30 years of answering telephones, okay? There's nobody in the whole private sector except maybe the CEOs of the biggest corporations that would have anything remotely resembling that, right? There's nothing like that. And so these pensions are what's called defined benefit pensions. That means no matter what happens to the markets, no matter if the entire pension fund is vaporized in a stock market collapse, taxpayers are just going to have to make up the difference, and these employees, the ex-employees, will still get the same amount of benefits they were promised. Meanwhile, you and I, if we're lucky, we have a 401k that just got decimated amid the forced shutdown. So, it's a problem that we could spend 10 years talking about. There's no easy solutions. A lot of people are going to have to take haircuts. That includes government employees, and it includes taxpayers, because of these absurd promises that Democratic politicians and some Republican politicians made at the behest of the government sector, big labor unions. So we're facing a financial catastrophe ahead on so many fronts. The pension front is one part of it. The $200 trillion in unfunded federal liabilities, that's another big part of it. The Federal Reserve printing money like it's going out of style, that's another part of it. The mega banks sucking up all this cash that the Federal Reserve is printing is another big part of it. But this stuff is going to devastate the average American if we don't start figuring out how to solve it in a sensible, in a sustainable way. We're looking at the edge of a cliff right now.
Yeah, so just today, the news headlines came out with Steve Mnuchin and others saying that, again, using the word unlimited, that basically the Federal Reserve stands ready to use unlimited funds to backstop whatever the banks need, whatever the markets need. Will the banks bail out everything and own everyone?
That's where this is going, actually. And that was actually the subject of one of my articles in the special report on the coronavirus, was the economic calamity that we're looking at. So you have a system now where a privately owned cartel of mega banks masquerading as a federal agency, right, the Federal Reserve, has the authority from Congress to print infinite amounts of money. They've set up these front companies. They call them special purpose vehicles to try to confuse the average citizen who has no idea what that means. It's just a front company, okay? And they're filling these front companies with currency that they printed or created out of nothing just by typing some numbers into a computer. And then they're going out and then they're buying real stuff, okay? They're buying companies. They're buying equities. They're buying municipal bonds. They're buying state bonds. They're buying U.S. Treasury bonds. They're buying corporate debt. They're buying up everything. And so, this idea, and a lot of people, well-meaning, seem to think, what's wrong with that? We just have the Federal Reserve save us all. If it was that simple, the people of Zimbabwe right now would be living large, and unfortunately, that's not what's happened. They're actually starving to death. They're dependent on the United Nations for food aid just to be able to survive, okay? This doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work. It's been tried in so many countries. But what we're facing now, if we don't slam the brakes on this, is a situation where we'll wake up and we'll find out that the mega banks created currency to buy up everything around us. They might literally end up owning the ground under your feet and your home, right? They're buying mortgage-backed securities, which are just a complex term to describe a financial instrument bringing together a bunch of mortgages. So the Federal Reserve might already own your mortgage, okay? And now they forced you to lose your job because they shut down your business. They forced you to lose your company. Your company's in bankruptcy because you can't operate it. And what happens? They say, oh, yeah, that's a nice house you have. Well, now the Federal Reserve owns it. And, it's not the first time they did this. They did it during the last economic crisis in 2008, 2009. And we had a similar situation, just on a much smaller scale. They ended up owning tons of people's mortgages. They ended up owning the Red Roof Inn, for crying out loud, right? This national hotel chain, which Alan Grayson talked about on the floor of Congress. But we are now heading toward a situation where the mega banks, through the Federal Reserve, might end up owning everything. And, we got a sneak preview of this in the Great Depression, right? The bankers basically collapsed, mostly the Federal Reserve. They shrunk the supply of money, caused, debts to just start, collapsing. People couldn't pay because there was less money in the system. And what happened? Asset prices collapsed, home prices, stock prices, business prices, everything started collapsing. And then the mega bankers came in and scooped it all up for pennies on the dollar. We may face another situation very similar to that if somebody doesn't get this situation under control and quickly.
That does turn us to our last question, which is, what can we as the vestiges of a free people do about this at this time? What can the individual do? What can we united together do? How much of it is at our local level? How much of it is through online association like this, getting the word out? What can we do?
Yeah, and that's such an important question. It's such a huge question. And I would say step one, make sure your relationship with God is good, right? Make sure you're praying. Make sure, you don't have any kind of, big sins on your conscience, because we're heading into some pretty crazy, in fact, we're in some pretty crazy times. If you had told people 3 months ago that everybody would be locked in their houses, cowering, and our churches wouldn't be meeting, and our companies would be going bankrupt, and we'd be losing our job, they say that's crazy. Okay, we may be heading into some stuff that's significantly more crazy than what we're dealing with now, and so you want to make sure you're right with God. Step one. Step two, then, make sure your family is doing okay, right? Make sure you and your wife are good. Make sure your relationship with your children is good. Make sure your children are being properly educated. I think that's one of the most important things that an average individual American citizen can do, is make sure your children are getting a good education. Make sure they're learning how to think. Make sure they're learning what the Bible says. Make sure they're learning the Constitution. And make sure they have access to the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of mankind going back thousands of years, right? You talked about earlier how that's being deliberately kind of cordoned off, and now we see Google trying to manipulate search results. They're trying to disappear all this, even for the few who still have the ability to think and the ability to read and access these tools. So make sure you're well educated. Make sure you're educating yourself on all these things, and then get together with others and educate others. I think the only solution to this over the long term is to have a moral, a godly, and a well-educated citizenry demanding that we have reasonable government, and nothing else is going to change it. All these people who want the silver bullet of, we're just going to have a constitutional convention and that's going to fix it, or we're just going to elect the right congressman or elect the right president and then everything is going to be fixed. I'm sorry, I don't mean to burst your bubble, but that is absolutely, positively not going to work. Okay, the reason why we have this level of person, if you will, in Congress and in our state legislatures is because we, the people, are voting for them. Except in California and Illinois, where the vote fraud is rampant. But by and large, we have elected these criminals to Congress to represent us, and so we shouldn't be surprised. And just working really hard in the next campaign, you should do that. But that's not going to solve the problem. We've got to fix the electorate before we can fix the governing bodies. And so I think education ultimately is going to have to be the solution. Watch shows like this one and learn useful things. Get a subscription to the New American Magazine and stay on top of the news. Go back and read books. There's a lot. It's crazy how they hide all the secrets in the library, right? Make sure you know history. Make sure you understand civics and all these things that are just so important. And so, that's what I would say. And I could talk for months on the solution, but I think that's kind of it in a nutshell is, get right with God and make sure you and your children are getting educated and make sure you're sharing that with other people.
How about on the household homeowner trying to make sure that they get their finances protected? You've talked a lot about on the relationships, the spiritual, the informational, the logic, the reasoning, and communication. Okay. How about like the fact that the pension crisis is upon us? As they said in the Lord of the Rings, open war is upon us whether we risk it or not. So here we are. So it's a little bit late in one sense to start building the next generation. We got to do it anyway. Yes, we got to do that. But what can we do right now to get through the financial crisis that looms over the next 5 years for many American families?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to try to get out of debt if you can. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you are a slave to these lenders, especially when you realize that they're creating the currency out of nothing and charging an interest on it that they never even created in the first place, that it's a giant, enormous scam/Ponzi scheme. Do your best to become independent of the system. But, at a macro level, talking about the broader economy and the monetary system, it is going to have to undergo complete and total reform. And it's actually going to come no matter what. The question is, which way do we go? If we let the elites, the establishment, the people running the Federal Reserve, the people running the UN and the IMF get their way, they've already told us where this is going. Plain and simple, in plain English, in black and white. You can read their publications. They told us what they want. They want a one world currency controlled by the International Monetary Fund, of course, controlled by themselves. They call it a special drawing right. Even during this coronavirus, they're putting out press releases at the IMF website that we're going to inject global liquidity in the form of new, $50 billion worth of special drawing rights to poor countries. They are moving very quickly toward basically turning the Federal Reserve System that we have in the United States into a global reserve by a bunch of elitists. And so that's the route that they want to pursue. When the chickens come home to roost, the economy starts imploding. In fact, it's already happening now. That's the route they want to take us, right? Capitalism failed, the free market system failed, and so now we have to move toward basically this global technocratic socialistic system is what they're going to tell us. The real solution is to go back to a free market system and go back to an honest, sound monetary system. And that means eradicating the idea of fiat currency, the idea that we can have to pay interest on fiat currency they created out of nothing. We need to go back to an honest monetary system, preferably based on gold and or silver or some sort of commodity, something that can't be printed and manipulated. And short of that, they are going to continue to have us by the throat, and it's going to be next to impossible to get us out of this financial cataclysm that we're heading towards. And they'll they'll use this collapse that we're heading towards as an excuse to move their agenda forward. And that's why I say education is so critical. If you don't understand how the Federal Reserve works, if you don't understand how the commercial banking system works, you're going to be vulnerable to being manipulated, to being stampeded into accepting the false solutions that they're already offering us. And so we really, again, I go back to education. We've got to familiarize ourselves with how the current system works, what the flaws are, and how we can move in a better direction.
You've just reminded me, I'll put a link in the description to a video we did about 9 months ago called What a Homeschooler Uncovered at the Federal Reserve and U.S. Mint. So I'll put that link in there. Alex, if you could remind our viewers one more time how they can find out about your work and get access to some of those free downloads that you mentioned.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on the program. It's been wonderful. So these special reports, you can get these at thenewamerican.com. Subscribe to the print magazine. You get it every twice a month. This one you can get for free. We'll have a banner ad there. It just says "Freedom is the Cure." Click on that, and we'll send you the PDF for free. And then also, you can get the daily email update for free. Every day, just give us your email. We'll send you the top 5 or 6 headlines of the day. So that way, whether you're relying on Facebook or Google or YouTube or whatever, they won't be able to stop you getting the real news in your inbox. That's thenewamerican.com. And, I'm on social media too. If people have a question or whatever, I'm always available. And thank you once again for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Alex Newman. He's the foreign correspondent for the New American and the founder of libertysentinel.org. Folks, if you want to make sure that you're on our free email list, go to libertyandfinance.com and go on the left side. Go ahead and sign up for the free email there. Alex, thanks for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.